And we'll go ahead. Looks like we have 51 participants today. I guess I just sent out an announcement to Canvas, which is reminding everybody that the students are allowed freely to use the FSU Zoom account. So you don't need to purchase any advanced pro accounts or anything like that. Every student is allowed to host meetings and schedule meetings through this Zoom portal once you've signed in with your regular ID and password. So I really recommend this for teamwork. You can get together and talk. Everybody gets to see everybody else talking. You can share your screen, and I think it's possible to work very effectively this way, particularly on something like an online presentation, which is going to come to us over the internet anyway. We've sent out instructions. Carrie is posting the sign-up sheets for the sessions. I'll include 2 Saturday sessions that I'll do for people who would otherwise have trouble making, with other class schedules or other commitments. So there'll be enough slots for everybody to talk about their Milestone 3 product from the teams. And we'll get you moving on correcting those, trying to get those in tip-top shape, and you'll be ready to go on and get started on the final version of the extended abstract, bibliography, and then online presentation. And then we'll also have sign-up sheets for online presentations. And to be fair, I think we'll schedule the people who have the earliest scheduled conferences with Carrie or me will get the earliest scheduled slots. We'll get the latest, the earliest, how should we do this? We'll get the earliest scheduled slots. And that way it'll stagger, how much time you have between when you get advice and when you're expected to do your presentation during class period. So any questions about online material, online access, before I start resume the lecture about nutrients from the sea? So go ahead, remember the drill. If you press your space bar, you can speak and everybody will be able to hear you. Any questions? Everybody's able to see the screen? Can somebody tell me that you're able to see the screen and everything is on track?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you, Morgan. All right, so I wanted to carry on with the lecture where we ended off yesterday. We ended up talking about this delectable diet item that you can buy at your local McDonald's. And I pointed out that this is fish, but it's processed fish, and it's very different from a sort of a fillet or a piece of fish that you might get, different from fish and chips that you could buy less often than you used to be able to. So this is a processed product, and it's most of the fish processing techniques that make food were pioneered by Japanese. And so a lot of you have had crab with a K and various other Asian style fish products. Well, the fish fillet is an example of that. And you start with a soft-bodied fish, in this case the Alaska pollock, and this is skinned and deboned and then macerated into a fine paste-like substance, and there's emulsifiers and other things added to it, and then it's formed into these appetizing square slabs of food. They're actually not that bad to eat, and the Alaska pollock is a reasonably sustainable fishery, so you can feel okay about eating McDonald's fish fillet. Well, let's talk a little bit about fishing methods. We started with an introduction thinking about purse seining and how purse seining really revolutionized the ability of landing the Peruvian anchovy, then also had the downside of resulting in a lot of overfishing. So I want to go through a series of different fishing methods, and then we'll talk about some of the kind of fish that are caught in these animals. So one of the other sort of classic modes of fishing is what's called trawling. And so everybody's heard the term trawling for, as a way of searching for things or finding things indiscriminately. And that's exactly what happens with trawling. There's sort of no targeting. Well, there's limited targeting, but I'll talk about that in a second. But the operator typically cannot see the net on the bottom. So this guy, this is a bay shrimper, and he's hauling in one trawl net. And with an operation of this size, he'll know where he is, and he'll be trawling across specific grounds where he thinks that shrimp are likely to congregate, but he can't see what the net is encountering. So it's a sort of a blind fishing method. The trawl net consists of a number of different components. There's a bag-shaped net with long wings on either side. And then there's the net sort of funnels down into a long throat. And at the very end of the throat, there's what's called the cod end, or the bag end of the trawl. And so the way this works, and then on either side of the wings, there's a bridle, these are bridle lines, and they're attached to what are called either otter boards or trawl doors. And these are stiff wooden or metal doors, and they're angled outwards so that as the boat moves forward, typically at a 2 or 3 knot rate, the hydrostatic pressure being exerted on the doors pushes the net apart, and so it opens it laterally from side to side. Along the top of the net are a series of floats, and you can see these coming in on the winch right here. And so there's a whole series of floats across the top of the net. That's called the float line. And these floats are not buoyant enough to lift the entire bag of the trawl, but they hold it open. And then likewise on the bottom, to keep the bottom of the trawl net, the foot line, in contact, there's weights and chains attached to this line. Now for heavy trawling on broken ground, sometimes the trawlers will put big rollers or big fins and slats on the bottom to help the net sort of ride over obstructions on the bottom. And this mode of fishing, I talked about the orange roughy fishery. Let me go back and find that. Yeah, so this is the orange roughy being landed, and you can see here the cod end has been opened up, and it's spilled all these orange roughy out into the trawl deck. So there are many hundreds, probably close to a ton of fish landed in this operation. The problem with orange roughy fishing by trawl is that in order for the trawl to go over the hard ground of the seamount, they put these very heavy metal rollers on the bottom of the trawl net. And the passage of those rollers just tends to kill and crush and pulverize the corals that live on these seamounts. And so this is something that's been very destructive of deep sea corals, not just in the Pacific by the orange roughy fishery, but off the Atlantic coast of Florida. Large areas of deep sea corals were crushed and destroyed by the trawling operations of just a handful of shrimp fishermen. And so this method of fishing, although it isn't seen, you don't really see the destruction that this kind of fishing causes. It can be very widespread and very long lasting. And even in soft ground, when the bottom is muddy and you don't need those kinds of rollers, the passage of the trawl really alters the bottom, and the marks of trawls can be seen in side scan sonar records all over the Gulf Coast and up and down the east coast of the US, where trawling has been very heavily practiced. And so that is another, over time, very substantial impact on the benthic ecology of the ocean where fishing is practiced. So that's trawling. The kinds of fish that you would catch in a trawl, orange roughy was one. Cod is another, And shrimp is another very commonly caught trawl species. In the Gulf of Mexico, shrimp fishery is based on trawling, entirely on trawling. One other thing about trawling is that it's indiscriminate. So you get the shrimp that you're aiming for, but you also get a substantial amount of other fish, turtles and porpoises, and fish that are not of commercial value. And so typically the shrimp trawling operation, gets a few pounds of shrimp and 20 or 30 pounds of bycatch, which is just shoveled over the side, and is an incidental kill in the trawling practice. And so you can imagine that this mortality being inflicted on the benthic fish community has a substantial impact above and beyond whatever the removal of shrimp causes. So this is a method of catching fish. It's very effective, and it can be used. I guess let me add one other thing about trawling. So this is what's a bottom trawl, and so this is being dragged across the bottom. There are also midwater trawls, and so midwater trawls will ride up in the water column, and they don't actually even touch the bottom. So the trawling for Alaska pollock, for example, is done with these sorts of midwater trawls. And some trawl spot called trawl caught species, the Atlantic cod, Gadus morhua. And this is, as I said, this species was incredibly important as a food product, for hundreds of years. And so many of the colonists, early settlers in the United States, particularly in the northeastern area, would have come over seasonally to engage in the cod fishery. Now, in the olden days, they didn't trawl for cod; they fished for them with hand lines, and so the trawl fleet would have comprised a mothership and then numerous of these dories. These were, relatively smaller boats, very seaworthy, and there'd be a crew of 2 or 3 or 4 hand liners that would go out from the mothership and hand line for cod during the day. Well, the other kind of fish species that's caught in trawls is the brown shrimp, Penaeus aztecus, and this is the fish, one of the primary fish products of the Gulf of Mexico, and a very, very valuable fish product in terms of the value of the landings and the widespread demand for this kind of species. The brown shrimp fishery has declined, and the seasonal closures are much longer than they used to be. And but there have been improvements in trawl catching, in that they have introduced high openings in the top of the trawl net that allow the larger animals, turtles, porpoises, and so forth, to escape from the trawl, and also hopefully prevent a lot of the bycatch from entering into the trawl net. So there have been considerable improvements in trawl fishing in the Gulf to try to mitigate some of the impacts. Nonetheless, trawling remains a potentially destructive form of fish catch. Okay, well, here's the other fishing method that we've heard about, and this is the purse seine. And here you see, previously I showed you the mothership where they were hauling in this net. Well, this is the chase boat that would go out and deploy it offshore. And so what you see here is that the chase boat has the skiff, as it's identified in this drawing here. The skiff has pulled the net from the mothership and pulled it around in a big circle. And by big, I mean really big. These can be 200 meters, 250 meters across. So this is, literally close to a kilometer or more of net which goes out. And all along the top, there is this float line. That's the float line. And so that holds the upper end of the net floating right near the surface. And then there's a lead line along the bottom, and this is a weighted line that holds the net vertically in this this fence-like configuration. And then, as I said earlier, when the encirclement is completed, the ends of the net are joined together at the top, and then this cable, this line is winched in by the seiner winch on the ship, and that closes the bottom, trapping all the fish that are swimming in the net within this circle. And then there, everything is sort of pulled up, and then you end up with the pictures like I showed in the lecture yesterday. So this is most commonly used for pelagic fish. These are fish that swim at the surface of the ocean. And because it tends to catch large numbers of small fish, it's very effective at that. A lot of times the catch of purse seining is used for fish meal. We've already described the use of Peruvian anchovy for fish meal. In the Gulf of Mexico, one of the major seine caught species is menhaden, and also called porgies. And porgies are, very plentiful. They're trapped in abundance, and they're treated the same way. They're ground up and made into meal. So there are lots of porgy fishermen along the coast of the Gulf Coast. They typically operate in relatively shallow water, somewhat different from this perhaps. Purse seining is also used as a means of catching tuna. So a lot of the yellowfin tuna that you'll commonly, or albacore tuna that you'll buy when you buy a can of tuna fish, that will have been caught with this method. There are other methods of catching tuna, but most of the tuna that goes into canned tuna fish is caught with this method. Now there are some potentially destructive byproducts of this of purse seining. One is that anything that's swimming in this area also gets caught when the net is closed and the bottom is pursed together. Well, what might be swimming in a school of small fish? That would be larger fish, or even porpoises and whales. So it is often the case that there is a pretty substantial bycatch with this, including animals that we really would like to avoid catching, such as tuna. And so there have been a lot of regulations with the method of using purse seining to try to free tuna and to prevent their destructive bycatch of those species. So here are some of the seine caught fish. So this is the Peruvian anchovy, which we've already talked about quite a bit. And this is the menhaden, the important fish in the Gulf of Mexico. This is a yellowtail menhaden. You've probably seen, a fish like this, if you've ever gone snorkeling or anything in the Gulf waters. They're extremely common, and they often form very, very large schools, which makes them appropriate for purse seining. Another method of fishing, which is very widely discussed, is called long lining. In this methodology, they put out miles-long lines of nets, and so there'll be the line. Typically, this is a surface long liner. So the long line of net of hooks. So you put out a long line of hooks. So the long line of hooks is suspended at regular intervals with little floats and flags so that the line can be seen. And then within these intervals between the floats, there are a series of hooks hanging down, and these hooks are called snoods. And these hooks are all baited prior to being putting out. So the process on a purse seiner, so they usually have frozen bait, and sometimes they're catching bait with other methods on board. And so there's a constant workload on a long liner to be baiting the hooks for the next set of long lines to be put out, and then recovering these long lines. So a long submerged or floating line. There's also bottom long lining. It was also practiced, and that's similar to this, except the long line lies on the bottom. This is also a fishing method that targets pelagic fish, but it specifically goes after the larger pelagic fish. That would include species like tuna fish, swordfish, dorado, also called mahi-mahi, so these are fish that would be caught on a long line. There are two problems with long lining. Well, there are a number of problems with long lining, but two of the prominent problems is that they catch anything that goes after what's on the bait. And that can include turtles, sharks, which are not desirable, seals, birds, a whole variety of marine animals that are not desired to be caught by the longliner who's focusing on the high dollar swordfish or tuna, but nonetheless get caught up in this process. And so the bycatch on long lining can be significant. The other problem with long lining is that sometimes because of a storm or bad weather or other accident, the line will drift away and break loose from its floats, but still sort of move through the ocean. And that becomes what's called a ghost line. And, those hooks can go on catching fish, for months or longer. So that can cause a lot of unnecessary, completely wasteful destruction and mortality among marine animals. So longline caught fish, swordfish, and tuna, they have a very high market value per fish. And the longline tuna fishery is for the larger species of tuna, up into including bluefin tuna. And they're pulled in also swordfish, dorado. These are reasonably widely caught fish that are caught with long lining methods. Final couple of methods I'll talk about include traps. And many people have seen the most deadly catch, or the deadliest catch, which chronicles the activity of crab boat fishermen in Alaska. And so, you're familiar with that. The crab boat fishery will go out with hundreds of these very large, heavy wire traps built with steel bars and steel, or steel bars, a steel frame, and then a net mesh covering. And the net, the trap features this sort of labyrinthine entry. And so the fish can swim in through this opening, and they'll swim in because they're attracted to a bait, or sometimes fish will just swim into traps because they like to get into small spaces. But typically, I'm sorry, they're talking about crabs, so the crabs will crawl into this trap here. Fish are also caught in similar sorts of traps. And the crab or the fish is after the bait, which is inside the trap. And then once it's gotten to the bait, it finds that it can't get out again. It's not smart enough to solve the puzzle of going up in order to get out. And so crabs in particular are vulnerable to this catch, but fish species as well from traps with somewhat different designs. And now the Alaska crab fishery was one of these boom and bust fisheries. And so starting in the late 90s, the crab fishery really ramped up. There were dozens and dozens of crab boats were built. These were built because the banks chose to extend credit for purchasing crab boats. And so many crab boats were outfitted and built. And these are expensive vessels. They have to be offshore in heavy weather for weeks at a time. They have to have all of the equipment for hauling, freezing, processing, and then the many traps have to be purchased. So this is this kinds of fishing requires a high capital investment. And one of the reasons that the crab fishery expanded so quickly in the 90s and early 2000s was that there was plentiful credit available from the banks to expand the fishery. And so what was happening here was that the fishing operation was engaging in removing the uncaught portion of the population. So if we go back to our logistic curve, and I'll project that. Okay, so what's happening in the case of the crab fishery, and this is sort of a classic example, is that when the Alaska king crab fishery really started to expand, the population was very large. And so the initial landings of crab were very plentiful, and people caught many, were able to bring back, many crabs, tons and tons of crabs. And it was relatively easy to catch crabs. It didn't take much effort. So the catch per unit of effort was quite high because they were attacking an unexploited population, or exploiting a untapped population. Okay, so that pulled this population size down, and the theory of maximum sustainable yield is that it should pull it down to this median point, and then you would extract the amount of growth per year from the population. Well, this shows the difficulty of attaining these sorts of maximum sustainable yield management strategies, because you're trying to manage dozens and dozens, maybe even hundreds of crab boats, each one of which has got a big mortgage to support, and and not only while that's happening, the demand for crab has been driven up because the price has been low. So people have been buying crab and acquiring a taste for king crab. And so you start to approach this theoretical minimum size, at which point you should put on the brakes if you were managing this population in a perfect way, and then start reducing the annual catch, reducing the level of effort, so that you weren't driving the population below this theoretical MSY population size. But the problem of estimating the actual number of fish in the population, and the difficulty in regulating the activities of many boats meant that they overshot this maximum sustainable yield. So in the mid-1990s, the crab boat fishery, which had expanded very rapidly, experienced a crash because they had pushed past that. Now the crab fishery, and it was shut down for some time. Now it's recovered, and they manage the crab fishery by limiting the season. And that's one of the discussions that you hear on the dangerous catch, is the discussion of, they have to get out and fish, and it has to be very intense, because the season will close and then they're done. So that, limiting the entry, limiting the number of boats that are licensed to fish, and limiting the time that they can fish is one way that managers can get closer to that sustainable yield. And it may be that they've done a better job, that they've corrected for the level of catch, and that they are close to sustainable with the crab fishery. So these are some examples. This is the golden king crab, Lithotes equispinus, and this is a crab. This is the walking crabs, as the Lithotids. They have 3 walking legs. They're nice and spiny, and they're quite large. The golden king crab can be, a meter across, some even larger. That's pretty common. And crabs and lobster are very high value catches. Another species that's very traditionally caught by traps, or what they're called pots, is the American lobster, Homarus americanus. We can also catch the Caribbean lobster, which is more common in this part of the world. But these are also crustaceans which are caught in traps. Crabs and lobster are high value catches. As I said, there have been sharp declines in the population, which has produced shortages and meant for disruption in the industry. Interestingly, lobster catches have over recent years increased, and there's a good ecological reason for that, because the cod, as I said earlier, the cod fishery has crashed. The population is much reduced below its to a fraction of its original size. Well, one of the main foods of cod, particularly large cod, were lobster, both as adults and less as full adults, but certainly the juvenile lobster were heavily predated by cod. So if you remove the cod from the fishery, the lobster population has increased. And so the catches of lobster have expanded. Now, what this rebalance of the food chain in the marine ecosystems where lobster occur, what that has the long-term consequences for that, that's a question for debate and research. Nonetheless, this is an example of how when we start removing fish through our fishing activities, there are sometimes unanticipated consequences, and they can be beneficial if you're a lobster fisherman, or they can be quite damaging, and I'll show some examples of that in a second. All right, so I'm going to put this reading exercise on the canvas, and I'd like you to read this article. It's pretty short, by Daniel Pauly, and I'll have a short 5 or 6 question quiz to go with this. This will be put up for extra credit, but I strongly recommend that everybody read this. And Daniel Pauly is really, I've met him several times. He's a very impressive guy. He's originally from Ghana, so he's I guess spent most of his career in British Columbia. Very tall, well-spoken, charismatic character. And he was working for a long time for the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN. And as part of his job as a fishery scientist, they asked him to figure out what was happening with the catch statistics worldwide. Because Pauly noticed a particular, and many others, noticed a kind of a paradox in that they knew that populations of fish were being overexploited, in some cases, crashing completely, but year on, year out, the catches reported by governments kept going up and up. And so this is a fundamental contradiction. How could it be that the populations are being reduced and the fishing pressure is resulting in overfishing, yet reported landings are increasing? And the answer, Pauly decided, was that fish producing countries tend to be untruthful in their reported landings. Particularly China and Korea and some of the other countries would tend, China in particular, the managers who were compiling the data knew that they were required to show ideologically a steady increase in landings. And so they would essentially fudge the numbers. So rather than report the true landings, they would inflate the amount that they had actually brought to shore. And so, and these numbers would be turned in as part of the global statistics that the Food and Agriculture Organization, the UN, was collecting. And so they thought that there was many more fish being, or they were reporting many more fish being landed than were actually being landed. And, in addition to sort of deliberate misreporting, there are also difficulties in reporting everywhere because these statistics, because they have to be gathered from, dispersed independent operators who don't necessarily have, great connection to government. It can be very difficult to collect fishery statistics. So what did Daniel Pauly do? Well, he decided that it was impossible to, or very difficult to get accurate numbers of the actual landings, but it was possible to track what kind of fish were being landed, and specifically to look at the trophic level of the catch. What do I mean by the trophic level of the catch? So you remember the marine food chain, and in the marine food chain, we know that the largest individuals tend to be at the top of the food chain. So the biomass, standing stock biomass, is inverted towards the larger individuals. And as you go down in the food chain, you tend to get to smaller individuals that are shorter lived. So the Peruvian anchovy is an example of a fish species that's lower down in the food chain than, for example, cod or mahi-mahi or swordfish or some species like that. So the trophic level of the different fish species that were reported as part of the catch is something that is very well understood from the science of ichthyology and the life history of fishes. Pauly recognized that by keeping track of the relative numbers of different species, within the catches, the reported catches, and then assigning these different species to trophic levels, he could more accurately assess the stock size, or he could more accurately assess the way in which landings of fish were changing over time. And so this is the catch per unit of effort in years. And so, you know, it ramped up from the 50s, and by the 80s and 90s, it was up around close to 150 million tons per year of catch. And that sort of leveled off. You know, they weren't catching more fish. And then more concerning, the level of the trophic level began to decline. So looking at that same graph, so this is the total increase in landings. You can see that this increase is going up pretty steeply. And then this is that for that same period, what the trophic level of the catch was, compiled from using Pauly's method. And so you can see that there's been a significant decline in the trophic level of the catch for global marine fishes and then global freshwater fishes. And in fact, the freshwater fishes have experienced a more sharp decline than the global marine fishing. And so, so that's the trend toward lower trophic levels. Now, aquaculture, which I'll talk about in a little bit. This is one of the alternative means of producing fish. And you can see that over this time period, taking the Norwegian aquaculture as an example, and they have a very advanced aquaculture system, that the trophic level of what's the species raised in aquaculture has steadily increased. And so aquaculture, in terms of producing the larger, more valuable fish, has, to a large degree, begun to supplant the landings from the global fishery. Okay, so that, you know, we've talked about, you know, fishing and how removal of species changes the fishing, the marine ecosystems, and that the difficulties in arriving at, you know, sustainable landings, and then the consequence of overfishing, the very, very widespread occurrence of overfishing among global fisheries. But, you know, we can back up and look at this same sort of picture, not just in terms of fisheries, but in terms of the impact that human society has had on many different types of marine species. And so we can start to dig into this problem that I indicated, that I talked about earlier, where you know, the species like cod are removed, and that produces an effect of increasing the population of their prey item, that is lobsters. And so this shift in ecological balance is something that has gone about quite a lot. Now, this is a sort of classic paper by Jackson. I believe it was published in about 2000. And Jackson used a variety of data sources to characterize different important marine ecosystems. And he used landings data. He also used fossil evidence. They looked for skeletal remains of fish species that were preserved in sediment, so they could take sediment cores and look at the kinds of skeletal remains of fish that were being preserved in these cores, and could compare that functionally across time. So, and this is a logarithmic graph, and so this is presented in years before present. And so here we're looking at cod. We've talked about cod, and we go back, way back in time. So he's going back almost 2,000 years. And we see that, you know, there is a initial increase. So about 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago, the average size of cods, now he's knowing this is being estimated from fossil records. The estimated amount of cods was, the estimated average length of cods was about a meter, about 100 centimeters. And then as we go forward through time, you know, 1,000 years ago, 100 years ago, 50 years ago, And then in very recent times, the length of cod has decreased. This is not saying anything about the population abundance or the total standing stock, just the length of the individuals. And so that has decreased very sharply. And if you remember that I said that one of the main indicators of overfishing was the reduction in the average size of the species that were caught, you can see that that's what's occurred here. And this is a collapsed fishery. Okay, so we know that fish populations are collapsing, and we can sort of see within the human scale. Okay, people used to be able to make a living as cod fishermen, and now that fishery is closed, so they've had to find some other work. So we can see the effect, of a overfishing and the impact on the ecosystem. But there are many sort of species that are important to the marine system that we don't use as food, and nonetheless, those species have been removed at very high rates, sometimes completely extirpated, that is to say, driven to extinction. And if we start looking at those numbers, the trends are very concerning. So there are two other species on this graph, and we're looking at different, these are oyster landings, and this is localities. And so this is tracking the occurrence or the distribution of the coral species called Acroptera. Acroptera, you're probably familiar with. Acroptera is the sort of elkhorn coral. So these are corals with brown in color, with many branching limbs, sort of look like kind of almost like cacti. And they're used to be very, very widespread. They occur in the shallower regions of coral reefs. They like high levels of light. And so again, using geologic and fossil data, he's able to go back, because the corals are preserved in the sediments very well. He's able to go back many thousands of years and look at how the levels of Acroptera have changed over time. And so, if we go back, this is, I guess, nearly several 100,000 years. So back in the time of the Ice Age, during the glacial period, and then stepping forward, 10,000 years. So, the end of the glacial period, and then moving forward into today. And you can see a very alarming trend here. So he's sort of seeing that there's an occurrence, and these are different. The triangles and the squares are different areas and different methods of conducting this. But over time, they sort of collapse. And Acroptera now is occurring at a very, very restricted range. So most of the elkhorn coral in the Keys, for example, have disappeared or are in very bad shape. And likewise all around the world. And there are many reasons for this. That includes fishing impacts, pollution, and other sorts of human impacts on reef systems. And then more recently, the impact of increasing water temperature, which produces the effects of bleaching and coral mortality. So this is an example of a key species, a keystone species in many coral reefs that has declined dramatically from its levels before human impact became so pronounced. And you can do the same thing with oysters. 100 years ago, we landed hundreds of tons of oysters. So oysters from the Gulf of Mexico were shipped all over the country, and they, in boxcars full of ice. They pack them up, they catch them in Apalachicola. They put them on a train with ice, and they'd have them in New York City, a day or two later, to be put on somebody's table. But over time, those landings have really, really decreased, and we all are familiar with the very unfortunate circumstances that the Apalachicola folks are, the oyster fishermen there. So that oyster fishery has almost completely collapsed, and they're having to close it to protect the species that remain. Well, okay, oysters, many of us like to eat oysters. I certainly do. But if you remove a species like oysters, which are so plentiful in many of these bay and estuarine systems, that produces a lot of unexpected consequences. A couple of things happen. The first thing is that oysters are filter feeders. And so oysters will filter out, and it's astonishing how much water is filtered through an oyster bed. They can filter literally the oyster beds of the Apalachicola Bay, of some of the other places where oysters were plentiful. The entire volume of the bay would be filtered, over a matter of days by the oyster populations. And so that filtering, what were they filtering out? Well, they were filtering out plankton, specifically the phytoplankton. And they were filtering out species of phytoplankton that, can, under some circumstances, bloom and cause hazard. And so by not filtering those algae, you change the base of the food chain very radically. And so it tends to become more eutrophied, and there are other effects, which I'll explore a little bit more here in a second. So, and the same thing with corals. I mean, corals are doing, this important function. So this graph is sort of showing different species declining and, over time. And, what's not shown here, but you can find in the original paper, is that the numbers of sea turtles, manatees, dugongs, sucows, monk seals, crocodiles, codfish, groupers, swordfish, sharks, and rays, many of these populations are now functionally extinct, reduced way, way below their historic levels. Well, what, can we think about, how this changes the ecosystem? So we're going to look at the example here of kelp forests. I was here earlier, just a second ago, I was alluding to what happens in estuarine areas where oysters are prevalent. But here we're looking at changes in kelp forests. So in kelp forests, one of the major primary producers are the macroalgae kelp. And before fishing, you have a sort of an interesting food chain. So there's a basic level of interaction. This is describing the kelp community in Alaska, and this is the similar community in the Gulf of Maine. And so this shows the sort of flow of nutrients. So, or the flow of predation. So cod are eating sea urchins, they're eating sea mink are eating sea urchins, they're eating lobsters. In Alaska and California, sea otters are eating lobsters and urchins, abalones, sea cows, like manatees, like to eat the kelp. And so there's this, the kelp then is at the base of the food chain, and so there's a flow of nutrients from the kelp through this food chain, and then a return of nutrients, as these components decompose and release their nutrients, recycle their nutrients. So there's a flow, through this complex food chain, and then the return of nutrients to the kelp. All right. So what happens if you start removing some of these, upper ends of the food chain? So in the case of the Gulf of Maine, the sea mink, which was a sort of small otter-like organism that kind of performed a similar ecologic niche to the sea otters, that's been apparently completely extirpated. They don't exist in the wild anymore. So sea mink are extinct. Cod continue to eat lobster, and they continue to eat sea urchins, but at very reduced numbers, and that's indicated by the fact that the arrows here are much thinner than the arrows in the undisturbed system. And sea otters, likewise. One of the things that happens is that killer whales start eating sea otters. Sea otters, they shouldn't be eating sea otters. They should be eating salmon and whales. So the orcas, if they run out of other food, they start eating sea otters. And a single orca can eat has to eat a lot of sea otters. So the orca can wipe out the sea otters, and with the loss of sea otters, then the controls on sea urchins, abalone are lost, and the sea urchins and abalone start feeding heavily on the kelp. And when that happens, the kelp forests can die back, and we already talked about that. So the fishing, we talked about how the crash in the kelp forests occurred because of overfishing for sea otters by furriers for sea fur, but you can get the same effect by removing the top of the food chain so that the sea otters are being eaten by whales. Okay, and so, this puts people into the loop, and then you can see that people are attacking every part of the food chain. There's not a sort of, they don't specialize. They go everything from kelp to sea urchins to lobster to cod to sea cows, and sometimes they drive species into extinction. And so the food chain becomes much more focused on people and much less on human consumption and much less diverted with these other landings. And the result of that over time is that when entire trophic levels are eliminated, the ecosystem becomes much more likely to become eutrophic. That is to say, is much more likely to have excess nutrients. And the example that I gave earlier was the example of oyster beds, where the filtering processes of the oysters were removing large amounts of algae. So that can happen. They also become subject to hypoxia, so the loss of oxygen, to climate change. So the whole system becomes much more sensitive, much more vulnerable. And the whole response tends to be greater than the sum of the parts. So you have this synergetic effect, for example, so we remove oysters, that leads to eutrophication, that leads to hypoxia, and that can lead to toxic blooms. And so how do we know when this is occurring? There tend to be sudden transitions of abundance, and these can be negative transitions. And the example of a negative transition of abundance would be the fact that it's so difficult to find healthy oyster in Apalachicola Bay. A positive transition of abundance would be an algal bloom, which of course we know have become much more prevalent along the Florida coasts. Well, there are ways that this can be mitigated, and one of the management techniques that I'll talk about in a little bit are creating marine protected areas. But if there's a loss of these refuges or places that aren't fished, that can also contribute to an abrupt decline. And the overall effect, if you wanted to sum all this up, fishing down the food webs tends to favor the microbialization, spelled wrong here at the end, of the global coastal oceans. So what does that look like diagrammatically? With human expansion, we have climate change, introductions, that is to say invasive species, mechanical destruction of the habitat, pollution, and altered removal by fishing. So all of these processes result in alterations to the marine ecosystem. And these alterations are difficult to measure. They're difficult sometimes to perceive because of the shifting baselines effect. But the ocean that we experience now is a very much degraded and less productive ocean than it was, even when I was your age. So, over the past couple of decades, several decades, there's been a continued significant decline in ecosystem health within the oceans, which is a direct result of human expansion and human impacts. Or at least this is the conclusion reached by Jackson et al. In this science paper, and I'm pretty persuaded by these arguments. So let's talk now some more in the time that we have. We still have about another 20 minutes. Well, actually, let me pause and see if there are any questions. Let me take a moment to take any questions about the material, and then if there are questions, I'll answer the questions, and then we'll go ahead and we'll start talking about some other individual aspects of fishing. So any questions on the material that I've covered so far?
I have a question.
Yes, Vanessa.
So when you were talking about how fisheries have been over time, the catch has been lowered in trophic level. Is that like reasoning behind the boom bust pattern in fisheries that they are very, very high and then they decrease and then they bounce back. Is that explained?
Well, I think that the reduction in trophic level is more of a, that's sort of normalized, and the results from Pauly were taken over the whole of the global ocean. So that, averages together, many, 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 many different fish populations which are being exploited. And so certainly embedded in that decline in the trophic level is the fact that fisheries, like for example, cod, has completely crashed. So if you think about it, if you've got a fishery that's bringing in fish that are high in the trophic level, and that fishery has to be shut down, or just as so the catch is so reduced that people stop fishing, then that change is going to feed into the overall global average and have the effect of reducing the average trophic level.
All right, thank you.
Other questions? Perfect understanding. That's what I aim for. Okay, well, let me go on then and talk about some other topics. And I'm going to continue with this idea of, how fishing, fishing is something that operates on an ecosystem. And, we have specific needs and tastes that have nothing to do with what the ecosystem will or will not support. And so, we like a certain kind of fish, or in this illustration, and the first example I'm going to give, suddenly people develop a taste for shark fin soup. And so shark fins become a valuable fishing product. I've eaten shark fin soup. I thought I needed to do that for research purposes. It's pretty awful. The shark fin is this sort of chewy, tasteless thing floating in a bowl of broth with some vegetables. Not something that I would go out of the way for, but it's very, very popular in certain cultures. And so shark finning, and then the shark fins can also be used for other things. So they can skin these shark fins, and they can use this big flat area of flesh to make, for example, artificial scallops. And so one of the things that's done with shark fins a lot is that they'll remove the skin, remove the inner cartilage, and then punch little cookie cutter scallop shapes out of this and say that this is artificial scallops, or offshore scallops. They have some name for it, but it really comes from shark finning. So for various reasons, cultural, and then because it can be reproduct or repurposed as a different sort of higher value product, shark finning has become a global phenomenon, attacking shark populations, many, many different species of shark populations. So, sharks are not a good species to exploit in this way, because they are very much K strategy reproducers. They have low rates of reproduction. They take a long time to grow to maturity, and this makes sharks very vulnerable to overfishing. And sharks are often taken as bycatch, meaning that they're killed in pursuit of some more valuable fish, and then they're also pursued for shark finning. And some species of skate and sawfish and deep-sea dogfish are now essentially extinct. Sawfish, for example, have greatly been reduced within their range, and other species of sharks have been declined. Well, this heavy fishing, this removal of the sharks and rays from the ecosystem, can have some unanticipated consequences. So this is landings of the top 10 chondrichthyum. This is a way of saying all fish species that have cartilaginous skeletons. And so this is the landings by country. And you can see that Japan was a big catcher of fish. And these are different groups of, and this is different landings in time. So this is Pakistan, Mexico, and Japan in this upper panel here. So the USA, has been a steady fisher of sharks and rays, and I'll show you some of the consequences. Likewise, India, Indonesia, Taiwan, they've really ramped up their fishing targeting of these particular species. And the same can be said for UK, Britain, and France. So the overall trend has been, to increase, fishing effort, but in many cases the landings have been reduced in time. So Japan has landed steadily fewer fish, and then the U.S., Pakistan, and Mexico, the numbers have really sort of topped off. Well, what ecological effects do they have? And there's a very, very nice study, which I'm going to present now, that explains, some of these effects. So we're going to turn to the Chesapeake Bay area and on the east coast of the United States. And we're going to describe what happens when the shark fishery was targeted for overfishing. And these are specifically the sorts of fish, black-tipped shark, tiger shark, sandbar shark, that are exploited for shark finning. And so shark finning activity really sort of ramped up on the east coast of the United States. Well, so this produced a cascading effect. And because what was the major prey item of these large sharks? Well, it turned out that it was the skates and rays. For example, this cow-nosed rays. So one of the principal prey items that these large sharks would catch would be these these rays. Okay, and so the effect of this targeting these things was to overfish, and the populations of these different shark species declined very rapidly. With that decline, there was a removal in predation pressure on the cow-nosed ray. Okay, so, and that's very similar to the example that we gave of lobsters, which rebounded when the cod fishery was reduced. You remove the predator or control the numbers of the predators, and its prey items, suddenly increase. The predation pressure lifts that carrying capacity for that particular species. Okay, so the population of cow-nosed rays suddenly increased. Well, when you increase the population of cow-nosed rays, that means that they are looking for their favorite food item. Well, one of the things that rays like to eat are scallops, queen scallops. So they fly along the bottom and they catch scallops, and they bring them into their mouths. They have specially developed jaws systems that can crunch up the shells, and they eat scallops as a principal food product. Okay, so you can see what's coming, can't you? The population of cow-nosed rays increases. They go after more and more species of scallop, and this is sort of showing the numbers of landings of different sharks and then their population size. So landings are going up and up and up, and the size of these different populations, sandbar shark, black-tinned shark, and everything, are going down. Cow-nosed rays numbers are increasing. Well, and this is what happens for the bay scallop. So the bay scallop initially increases, and then the bay scallop crashes as the population of cow-nosed rays, really increases to very high numbers. Well, this also has this very unfortunate effect of the fact that there's a very large and lucrative fishery for scallops. Scallops are a very valuable seafood product. As you know, if you've ever been to the seafood aisle at Publix and gone to buy scallops, they're $10, $12 a pound. So they're a valuable catch. So the consequence of one fishing group having success by catching sharks and removing their fins produced an effect where another fishing effort that was catching scallops crashed. And so this is a perfect example of this sort of what's called a cascading effect, where pressure on one end of the ecosystem produces changes, which in this case are very economically unfavorable on the other end. And not only are they ecologically unfavorable, but queen scallops are filter feeders, or they actually have tentacles, and they're more active filter feeders than than oysters, so they're more actively removing particles. They tend to eat larger plankton, but their removal is going to change the base of the food chain and probably favor the algal blooms. Well, let's see. I want to show you some examples of cases of monitoring. I hope this video will play.
You know, for years, we've been puzzling over the problem of showing people what's happening in the environment out in the ocean. Because so much of the important things that are happening to the ocean are happening, you know, way offshore, out of sight, or underneath the surface of the water.
You can't see what's below the waves, and you can't see what's more than 10 miles offshore. Nobody ever sees that.
I think it's really important for people to realize that, yeah, the ocean is huge. But it's not infinite.
The oceans are running out of fish. It's all the nations of the world. Commercial fishing vessels are taking too many fish. They're competing with each other to catch declining fish stocks. So they're working harder and harder and harder to catch fewer and fewer fish. So in the end, there won't be any fish.
Global Fishing Watch is a partnership between SkyTruth, Oceana, and Google to take all of the trackable commercial fishing activity in the ocean around the world and put it on a map on the web for everybody to see. So part of what we do at SkyTruth is just try to make the invisible visible. And we stumbled across this technology called automatic identification system. And it's a ship-to-ship system of radio frequency broadcasts where vessels can tell each other where they are, who they are, how big they are, and where they're moving and how fast. And it turns out that these ship-to-ship broadcasts can be intercepted by satellites flying overhead a couple hundred miles up. Based on the way the fishing vessel is moving out in the ocean, we can tell when it's actually engaged in fishing activity. So as long as you're actually broadcasting, we can construct a path that your vessel has followed and put that on a map for everybody.
And so now you can tell, based on when and where the fishing happened, overlaid with the map of what the rules are, you can see whether it was in a place that was legal or not. So, you know, it starts from a red and it goes up to yellow and orange and white. So the intensity of it shows you how much fishing is happening there. And then it's just like you're in Google Earth or Google Maps, just like you'd expect. Just zoom in, you move around, and you see where the fishing is. And then you have a little time slider that will let you move through the years and look at how the fishing changed over time.
So with Global Fishing Watch right now, even though the amount of fishing activity that we're able to see and show people is kind of jaw-dropping, it's really only the tip of the iceberg at this point. And just a glimpse at what the total commercial fishing picture is.
We enable thousands of watchdogs who are currently don't have the tools to speak up. And that's exactly what motivates me with SkyTruth, is taking the unseen world and making it more visible to more people, which inspires better management.
Okay, so that was an example of a method of monitoring and potentially controlling the amount of fishing worldwide. I guess one of the things, we skip ahead a little bit, show you this slide here. You know, one of the things that you see in this, you know, SkyTruth picture, and this is sort of going through that, is the way in which, you know, the fishing activity sort of concentrates along the EEZ boundaries. And so here's you know, an island, and its boundaries here, and fish tend to congregate, you know, fishing tends to congregate outside of it, but you can see that there's some people who are cheating, some fishing vessels that are cheating. And if you talk to the folks at SkyTruth, they have examples of having used their monitoring system to actually track individual vessels that were violating international waters and economic zones. And they've actually helped a fishing Coast Guard in Tonga, I think it was, to arrest and capture a fishing boat that had been habitually going in and catching fish illegally in their waters. And so this is a method for both understanding the distribution of fishing effort and the potential impact of this ecologically, and then for also tracking fishing effort as a monitoring tool. Okay, so that's SkyTruth. A few more things I wanted to say here. Of course, our goal, as scientists, oceanographers, citizens, should be to produce a sustainable fishery. And an example of a sustainable fishery, I want to close on a sort of positive note, is the Maine lobster fishing industry. Now, lobster fishing has benefited from the decline of the cod populations. Nonetheless, the management of the fishery has been pretty effective in that they've found a way to harvest fish, harvest lobster in a way that they believe is pretty sustainable. Now, they did it in a very interesting way. They completely, inverted the management system. So instead of having scientists and enforcement people at the top making decisions that then propagated down into the fishery, they flipped that around and they put local councils. So all of the main coast for lobster fishing is divided up into localities. And each locality of an area, a fishing area, is governed by a local council. And that local council, in the case of the way that the management of the Maine lobster fishery is, that local council makes all the decisions about who may fish, how long they may fish, and how much they can catch. And so they've imposed some certain restrictions on this. To become a Maine lobsterman requires an extended apprenticeship. So you have to really commit to this way of life and to following the guidelines of your overall community within your local council. So what this does is, in an interesting way, sort of philosophically, I start out by talking about fishing and fisheries by saying that no one owns the fish. But here's a way in which, empowering local councils and empowering local people to make decisions, not just for the short-term benefit, but, to produce an industry that can support people over time, requires a sense of ownership. And the fact that these local councils, control the fishing and control the entry and control the landings and make the other decisions themselves. They're able to get, these local councils, of course, are able to get the expert advice and the statistics and so forth, but they make the decision. By doing this, that gives each individual fisherman within a district a real sense of ownership. And so, I think it's quite interesting that this sense of ownership, can, in some cases, produce, very good husbandry, very good long-term care of a fishery. And so there are examples. One of the other sort of positive indicators is the increase in marine reserves. So marine reserves are areas that are protected from fishing, and they can produce, they can help exploited areas repopulate. I got some slides here on marine aquaculture. Looks like I'm just about out of time, but there are different types. There are coastal ponds, cage aquaculture. The thing about most fish farming is that it requires fish-based feeds. So in order to raise a population of salmon, I think this is a salmon in a offshore salmon cage, you have to go and catch smaller fish. And so, you're trying to reproduce, what the natural system would do, and you can never do that as effectively. These cages, because you concentrate fish in a tight area, they tend to produce high levels of eutrophication. And so that, salmon farms can really have an effect of eutrophication on the areas in the bays where they occur. Coastal ponds, shrimp and prawn, they tend to be exhausted over time. So this is particularly a problem in, a lot of the shrimp that you eat is not caught by trawlermen, but actually raised in shrimp farms, particularly in Vietnam, Indonesia, and there are some issues with that. I'll just see if this movie will play. Now, this is
Và
showing you
chất
how
lần
they
lượt được đưa vào thân,
how
gồm
they
giác tốt khỏe hơn,
process
phần
shrimp
đuôi
in
tôm sú.
Vietnam. And so they take the shrimp and they inject this sort of
1 kg tôm
paste
sú
into it,
sau khi bơm tạp chất
and that
vào sẽ tăng
lumps
trọng
it
lượng
up.
lên thành một ký mốt
And
hay
so,
một ngày.
you know, that
Đồng
can
thời,
increase
kích
the
cỡ tôm
weight by
cũng tăng
20
lên.
or
Khi
30%.
kích cỡ tăng thì giá mua sẽ
And
cao
so
hơn.
the next time you go to buy tiger prawns, you might think
Đó là
about
mặt hàng giàu Cà Mau.
what's actually occurring in
Chỗ
to
khác người
raise
ta
that.
kinh doanh Cà Mau.
In addition, so let me leave that. I just cover quickly shellfish culture. You know, it's hard clam bag culture is a big thing in Cedar Key, Florida. This is sustainable. Other species, you know, they're starting to develop methods of mariculture that use you know, ropes and other means to promote growth of oysters and mussels. And you know, this can have a beneficial effect on the local ecology. So aquaculture is an increasingly important protein source, and it's you know, contributing about 43% of aquatic food consumption. Most restaurant fish are cultured, not caught. Global consumption of fish such as salmon, shrimp, and catfish is growing. Most of it relies on low, uncosted environmental goods and services, which is an issue. I recently heard a radio program, the author Michael Pollan, talking about the potential for insect culture. And he was asked by the interviewer, well, do you think insect culture could become an important source of food? And he said, yeah, probably not. But one thing that insect culture could do is serve as an alternative source of the food product for species like catfish and tilapia that are widely grown. And so, you know, there are ways, responsible ways, that aquaculture could increase the production of seafood, which we all want. Okay, well, this you can look up on yourself. These are sustainable fish. I think I'll you know, bring this lecture to a close. I've gone slightly over time, but let me go ahead and pause here and see, are there any questions before I end this class? So please go ahead and ask any questions. There will be a quiz on this. Everybody understood everything? Okay, no questions? All right, so you'll be seeing sign-up sheets for the periods for the conferences about the Milestone 3, and I'll look forward to talking to each and every one of you. I guess also I sent out an announcement earlier. You'll see it on the Canvas announcement sites, just to remind everybody that all the FSU students are able to use the FSU Zoom account, so you don't need to have your own purchase any account or use any freeware account. You can log in through the link that I gave you there to the Zoom account, and you can organize and host meetings. And in those meetings, of course, just like we do here, you can share your screen, you can share your video, so you should be able to go back and forth. And I think this will be an effective method of fulfilling the requirements for Milestone 4 and for getting ready for your in-class presentations. Okay, if there are no questions, I will go ahead and end the program, the show now. All right, goodbye everybody. I'll see you Tuesday or when we get together for our conferences.